Hey there, friends. Dave Paulides, Canada Missing Project. This is Huck TV. Yes, the infamous Huck is the executive producer of the show, and there she is right there. Huck, how are you doing today? Huh? How are you doing today? Huh? Yeah, you're a good girl. Yeah, you're a good girl. She's been a good girl all morning. We had a little more snow last night, and she was outside romping around playing in it. Yeah, you're a good girl. Oh yeah, you're a good girl. Yeah, you're a good girl. And she's having some fun. Oh yeah, that's good. I know that's what you say when you want more. But I've got to go to work, and you have to monitor my activity. Okay? Is that okay? You stay. Be a good girl. All right. Now where we go? And what I'm going to tell you today is we've got a whopper of a show. Yeah, they all know you're here. They all know you're here. And it has to do with one case. Just one. But it's like a case I've never seen before. And I've seen a few. It's a, how can I say this? It's not that it's complex, but it's mystifying, and it's one of the most famous of all cases of missing people in Australia. Yes. But before we get on to that, and Huck wants to keep yapping, I have to make sure that I keep her happy, otherwise she'll start barking pretty soon and saying, "Hey Dad, why are you ignoring me?" and "Dad, give me more time," blah blah blah. I want to thank each of you for sending in cases, because without you I probably wouldn't even find most of the cases, especially in the United States. But in other countries, especially foreign countries with a language other than English, very hard to research those cases. So send them in, give me the translation of the articles, that would help. A lot of you have sent me a case out of Oregon that deals with a little missing 2-year-old boy, somewhat near the Oregon coast. I've been very reticent to comment about that for a multitude of reasons. Why is that, Dave? Okay. In most cases involving little kids, and the amount of time that this boy Dane has been missing, you would have seen some type of statement from the parents. I've seen nothing. So one of my questions is, when Dane disappeared, were both parents home? Was there only one parent in the home? Who was the parent home at the time? Had Dane ever walked away from that residence before? I have no idea. What's the background of the family? Do they both work? Are they criminals? What did the neighbors say about it? Had the neighbors seen Dane in the front yard before? I have never seen a case like this that went on this long where those answers, including the following, were never addressed. Biggest question I had is, when they brought search dogs to the scene of the front yard where supposedly Dane was at, what was the reaction of the scent dogs when they put him on the scent? Did they walk to the river? I want to know. How long did the family live there? This is important. Did the family own an animal? And then some of you are going to say, "Well, Dave, this is crude and rude, and you wouldn't do that." And I would. Did the family take a polygraph? How long did the family wait to call the sheriff from the time that Dane disappeared? All of these things I never heard the answer to. How cooperative was the family with law enforcement, with the sheriff that was there? Did the family ever believe Dane would walk towards that water while he was in that front yard? And whatever that answer is, I want to hear how they rationalize it. Oh, no, he never would. Well, how do you know? How many times did you leave in the front yard? Now, I always think about this from a law enforcement perspective, because we're here to protect everyone's rights, including the right of Dane. And the question comes up, should the parents be prosecuted for child endangerment, child neglect, ended up in a death? I really have mixed feelings about this. Why? Because if it was me home and I made a catastrophic mistake like that caused the death of my son, I don't care what you did to me. It would never be as bad as what plays in my mind every day about the loss of my boy. So in a lot of ways, I think the cruelest thing has already happened to that family. They lost their son. Now, if they were a family that didn't really care, now I have no knowledge at all about this family. I'm not casting any aspersions. I'm just speaking of all the possibilities. I've been in a lot of homes where the parents were so high they didn't even know where their kids were at. If that was the case, I would prosecute them to the hilt. But if they're a good family, I don't think I could do it. But that's why I haven't commented on this case. I've never seen a case like this where there was a lid on everything, and so few things have been stated. Just saying. I didn't mean to be rude to anybody who sent in information about Dane and the disappearance. Unfortunately, these things happen. Parents make mistakes. Children obviously make mistakes. So it's kind of my feeling on that case. And again, I have no idea about this family. They may be the nicest family in the world. Oh, on the polygraph side. Why do a polygraph, Dave? Well, because in the heart of the investigation, you have no idea what happened. You have no idea. You're dealing with somebody's life, that child. The first thing you want to do is you want to minimize the number of suspects you're looking at. And everyone's a suspect at that point. Everyone. I can remember on the Polly Klaas case, the FBI was doing a polygraph on Mr. Klaas, the dad. Yeah, I know, everyone knows you're here. And he flunked it. He flunked the polygraph. He had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance. Nothing. It was the wording on one of the questions that implicated him on some minor drug issue. And that's why he flunked it. And at the beginning, everybody thought, uh-oh. But right away, anybody who had any common sense knew he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance. But the polygraph eliminates people from suspicion. And if the husband and the wife or whoever was watching Dane passes both polygraphs, then we're on to something else. You know? But it's a tool. And I know some of you guys hate it. But until you've worked with it, you have no clue what it's like. You only hear what the press wants you to hear about it. But as someone who's worked with it, somebody who's taken 3 polygraphs, I can tell you flat out, they're an unbelievable tool. So, that's it on Dane. God rest his soul. The case I'm going to talk to you about today, out of Australia. Working on this case for a long time. There's a lot of twists and turns. But the missing woman is a woman named Margaret Clement, 70 years old, went missing May 22nd, 1952. No, it's not somebody with Alzheimer's. No, it's not somebody that has dementia. Nothing like that. Completely self-sufficient. She lived in a place called Tarwin Lower, southeast of Melbourne, Australia. If you looked at a map, like 100 miles southeast of Melbourne, you'd have to go southeast, and I'll show you a bigger map of it in a second. But the background, I'll show you the map. So Melbourne would be up in this area over here. Tarwin Lower, Tarwin River. The Tarwin River runs through the property where this lady lived at. It's called Tulare, and it's a historic homestead now. This is Evergreen right here. This is the ocean. Got it? Margaret's dad is a man named Peter Scott Clement. He was a farmer who became a director of a very famous gold mine in Australia called the Long Tunnel Gold Mine at Walhalla. And from 1868 to 1900, the mine took out $1,229,000 in gold. A lot of gold for back then. Peter became a very wealthy person. In 1907, he bought a property called Tulare. And it was a homestead of 2,114 acres. I just showed it to you. It cost him $17,000 then. A lot of money. Peter spent $10,000 stocking it with sheep and cattle and hired a crew to manage the livestock. And then he built and remodeled a 17-bedroom home estate and stocked it with giant Buddhas, satin ottomans, imported rugs, extravagant chandeliers, custom furniture. It was an exquisite estate. And it was right next to the Tarwin River. It had a beautiful setting. He spent thousands of dollars on landscaping. And the idea was to keep the Tarwin River in its banks. So he built bridges and levees and extravagant gardens, and he did it first rate. Now, when he was doing this, nobody really knew what he was doing it for. And then when it was just about done, he said he built this for his two daughters, not for himself. His two daughters being Jenny, 27, and Margaret, 25 at the time. The girls were super highly educated. Margaret studied French, Greek, and Latin. Both girls traveled worldwide and met many of the leaders throughout the world. In Australia, they traveled by limo and were at all of Melbourne's big occasions and parties. People from around the world came to them, stayed at their mansion. During the cold winter months, they would cruise the Caribbean and or the Mediterranean. They were true world travelers, very high level people, very wealthy. You kind of get the picture right now. Now, Peter always had managers for the livestock, property maintenance, and there was a lot. He never had the girls participate in any of the maintenance of it. They were too high level. Now, Peter died, and the girls in their mind always thought that the money would continue to flow. Well, it didn't. There was just a limited amount left when he died. Now, while Peter was alive, Tulare, the estate, and livestock. It was a profitable ranch. Well, the sisters didn't know how to make things work. They never had to work at it. They never had to manage it. And soon the money started to run out. And they had a sizable staff that they had to pay. So eventually they sold all their livestock to pay the people to keep it going as long as they could. And then in 1925, they took out a mortgage of $12,900, which at that time, friends, was a ton of money. But the mortgage company knew how much the property was worth. Now, obviously, they weren't thinking how the women were going to pay that off. But once workers stopped being paid, they left, and almost immediately the property started to go into disrepair. The Tarwin River is a river that goes up and down a lot. And if the levees aren't maintained, if the bridges aren't maintained, they're going to break, things are going to flood, property is going to get destroyed. Well, when the levees started to break, the area completely around the mansion flooded and became one giant swamp, just all the way around the property. Whereas people in the past and wealthy people would drive right up to the front door of the property, it didn't happen anymore. Couldn't happen. Area became overgrown. The only way to the house was walking through somewhere between a half mile and 1 mile of swamp. That swamp turned the sisters into hermits. And since the sisters had no mechanical skills, carpentry skills, once something broke, it stayed that way. And it eventually got worse. Well, Dave, that's bizarre. Yeah, it is. Now, in 1930, the mortgage on the property was owned by the National Bank of Australia, who sold it to a Melbourne solicitor for $13,846, who then sold it to a Gippsland farmer named Stanley Livingstone, who owned it for decades after that. Stanley Livingstone, remember that name. Now, during this entire time, the sisters didn't have any way to make payments. They weren't earning any money. Supposedly, they didn't have much money. Now, Stanley, when he got the property, he never tried to evict the ladies. He actually became their friends, he and his wife. And sometimes Stanley would wade the swamp himself and bring supplies that the ladies had requested. One time he came back from the property and he noted that the estate had broken windows, doors, bats lived in the house, along with snakes on tables, under ashtrays. Entire walls were green with mold. In his words, the house was a wreck. Well, that's not a good sign, is it? Well, Margaret was the sister that the neighbors knew in adjoining farms. She was the one that forged the swamp when she had to get out to get supplies. They never saw Jean. Nobody ever did. Now, Margaret would talk about Jean, but she never wanted to forge the swamp. Margaret was someone who always wore men's boots. She'd take them off, sling the boots over her shoulder to forge the swamp, lift her dress up, and carry the supplies. It's a picture of Margaret. One, highly educated, rolled in the highest circles, and then suddenly became destitute, and her sister lived alone with no communication, no way to get there unless you forged a swamp. Now this is the picture at about the time the incident I'm going to tell you about. And you can see the water surrounding this house. They called it an estate. It had 14 bedrooms. And I kind of described it to you. It was opulent. A neighbor close by named Bernard Buckley would sometimes shop for the ladies and bring them supplies to his home, and Margaret would wade the swamp and get there and get them. Most of the supplies were canned food, meats, fish, and vegetables. They would also need kerosene for their hurricane lamps. And when Bernard asked Margaret, well, what do you guys do out there? And she goes, you know what? Most of the time we read. And right now we're both reading Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's books. Remember, they're smart people. What else are you going to do at night? Margaret was once questioned about crossing a huge swamp and the deadly snakes that everybody knew resided there. Her response was, they never hunt the snakes. They never hurt the snakes. And the snakes don't bother her ever. She said, sometimes the most deadly ones swim right between my legs. Everyone agreed that based on the hundreds of times that Margaret had crossed that swamp, daytime and nighttime, she knew it quite well. Every time she crossed, she carried this long pole kind of thing. And she would pull ahead to make sure that the water didn't go over her waist. Many times when people came out, they didn't know the route to take, and the water would go up to their neck. In June 1950, Jeannie, her sister, died. She came out of the swamp, she told the police, and the police came in, walked in, carried a coffin, put Jeannie in the coffin, and then carried Jeannie through the swamp with the coffin above their head. Friends in the community had a funeral for Jeannie, and Margaret did come out and go to the funeral. Now, to explain Margaret adequately, she was a recluse, but she did have a personality. She did communicate with other relatives and her neighbors. She had communication skills, but I think in life, she just wanted to stay in that house. Like many older people do. They would just want to stay in their own home and not be disturbed. So once Jeannie died, Margaret's only companion was her mongrel dog, Dingo. And Dingo went with her everywhere. And how he was fed is that next to the house there was a huge trash pile, and he would rummage through the cans to see what he could find and eat. And people that went to the house said, I'm not sure if Margaret ever feeds him, but you can see he looks pretty healthy. But every time they went there, the dog was scavenging in the pile of trash. Now, this is very sad. Sometime after Jeannie died, Dingo was bit by one of the snakes and died. And post-death, he was partially devoured by something else. Nobody knew, but Margaret was pretty upset. About that time, Margaret went to visit her married sister. And while she was visiting her sister, this is in the story, in many newspapers, a handsome young man came to visit her and stayed at her sister's home for quite a while, talking to Margaret. When the man left, the sister said Margaret seemed very nervous and upset, and said, "I've got to get home." Nobody ever knew what this man talked to her about, who he was, or what he wanted, and she never said. About a year after that, headlines in the People, in the newspaper, "Men in Black visit." Whoa, we know what men in black are, right? That was the headlines. Three well-dressed men in black, driving an all-black English car, drove into the area of Gippsland, where Margaret lived, and they started to ask farmers about Margaret, ask for directions, etc. One of the farmers gave him the directions, and a neighbor saw the car drive out to the edge of the swamp, but they never saw anybody get out of the car or forge the swamp. It just drove out there. Nothing was ever said about it by Margaret. Nothing ever happened that we know of, but it was just odd. May 1952. About a month and a half, 2 months after this Men in Black thing. Now remember what I told you, Mr. Livingstone owned Margaret's property, the 2,000 acres. He was a well-to-do farmer. But Mr. Livingstone and his wife got to be good friends with Margaret. And regularly met with the lady when she came out, and they would invite her to dinner. So understand that Margaret wasn't a hoarder. She kept her house, not like you and I keep our house, but it wasn't a hoarder's place. May 21st, 1952. Mr. Livingstone was asked by Margaret to bring some things out to the house. He brought him out. Yeah, he waded through the swamp, brought him out, brought the supplies to her. And he had already talked to his wife, and his wife said, "Well, since you're going out there, invite her back for dinner tonight." So he did. He said that she was in good state of mind, positive, upbeat, nothing unusual. She said, "Yeah, I'll be there for dinner." Well, at 6 p.m., Margaret didn't arrive. And while it wasn't shocking, it was unusual. So the next morning, Mr. Livingstone goes back out there to find out what's going on. And he and his wife knew that every night, Margaret would make her bed. Well, he went out there real early. Bed was still made. Her walking pole that she used to go through the swamp was right there where it normally is. But she isn't there. It's deathly quiet. He searched the house from top to bottom, didn't find anything. Mr. Livingstone went back home, told his wife, and he was reminded by the wife, "Hey, do you remember last night in the middle of the night?" And he goes, "Yeah, when our dogs went crazy? Yeah." Could that be related? I don't know. Well, what happened was, midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, the Livingstones have 3 dogs, and they can see Margaret's estate from where they live. And all the dogs are standing on their property, staring at the estate, barking like they want to kill something. And they said it took a good hour to calm the dogs down. Now, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I got to think that has to play into this. Well, Mr. Livingstone noticed too that all the supplies he had brought the day before were in exactly the same position that they were when he left them. So, Margaret hadn't slept in the house that night. She hadn't even touched the supplies. The theory was she hadn't gone through the swamp because her pole was there, and she always took her pole with her. All the neighbors were questioned by Mr. Livingstone, and nobody heard a car, saw a car, or heard anyone come out towards the estate. Mr. Livingstone again went back the next day. I know, they all know you're here. Nobody saw anything. When he was at the house on that Friday, she wasn't there. Came back again. Came back, told his wife, and she said, you know, if we don't hear from her by tomorrow, let's call the police. So Saturday, May 26th, they notify the police. And the police get right on it. They get 20 locals and police on horseback going through the swamp. An inspector named Dendel was in charge, and he had grappling hooks used in the deepest part of the swamps and on parts of the river. The next day, May 27th, 60 men are on the search. And they even brought one of their best black trackers out, searched the home, searched the property. Yeah, a lot of the area around the home, in fact, all the area around the home was swamps. But once you get past the swamps, there's trees and there's a river, and they were searching everywhere because they had no idea what was going on. In fact, they searched the house 3 or 4 times, wanting to make sure they didn't miss anything. May 28th, Margaret's nephew, a young man named Clement Carnahan, arrived to help in the search. He was the boy of one of her sisters. He was from a town called St. Kilda. He was interviewed by the press after he was at the search all day, and he said, well, she had to have been murdered and kidnapped. And they said, but how would they get her across the swamp if she didn't want to go? He said she was in excellent health. She would have never left. But he didn't have a good explanation. He also said that in the decades that she had lived there, she'd never gotten lost in the swamp. The police stated right after that they were absolutely baffled by this case because none of it made sense. None of it made sense. They said that if she drowned, her body would have risen by now. Now, this is a picture of part of the search party checking the fields and the swamps. And you notice they're carrying guns. They're carrying guns because of the snakes. And here's a better picture of them searching in the swamp with guns. People were trying to walk and see if they felt her body underwater. Anything. So the police say at this point, on the 28th, if she disappeared on the 22nd, in those 6 days, her body should have come back up from the depths if she had drowned in the swamp. 29th, another 100 searchers, people on horseback, people everywhere searching, finding nothing. May 30th, same thing. More searching, more swamp searching. Nothing. May 31st, they take a different turn. They decide that they're going to get a bulldozer and they're going to take out an area where there's big trees and soft ground, just in case that she's in there in the mud or something. And they're going to drag the Tarwin River again. They drug it like 5 times. They found nothing. Remember what I said about the police being baffled? One thing I kind of admired about the police in this incident is that the police were adamant that there was no foul play. Nobody saw anyone go to the house. Nobody saw any cars in the area. The only unusual thing is Mr. Livingstone's dogs going absolutely nuts in the middle of the night. I've got my own theories about that. On June 2nd, the search and rescue is terminated. The police said they had found absolutely nothing. They felt that if Margaret had fallen in the swamp, then things carried over her shoulder, like her shoes and things, might have floated up. But they didn't find anything floating. They found some scarves and some other things on the perimeter, but it turned out that that belonged to other people. The chief inspector in charge of the case said it was his best guess that she's drowned out there and she'll show up sometime in the next couple of years. The swamp size was 800 acres. Completely surrounded the mansion. The nickname for Margaret during those years that she lived out there with Jeannie, she was called the Lady of the Swamp. And that got a lot of notoriety and play during the search. She had told family members that she was never going to leave that property. So her sisters that were, her other sisters that were alive, and her nephew said, I can't see her moving out of here. I can't see her leaving here. And if she was supposed to have dinner with somebody that night, she would have had dinner. Now in 1954, 2 years after she disappeared, she was declared legally deceased by an Australian court. And there were several people that stepped forward and tried to take control of the property. And then they argued that she had a will, she didn't have a will. There were so many nice things inside that house of value that, yeah, it's true, you might not own the property, but the things inside had value. And that's what I think they were arguing about. And her sister tried to step in, her nephew tried to step in, and in the courts, it went on for years. And I honestly don't know what the end verdict was, but it was many years. Now, of all the cases I've worked with, this is one of the most unusual. Everybody surrounding Margaret said one thing. I guarantee she did not kill herself. She was not suicidal, even though she lived in that house alone, even though she lost her sister and lost her dog. She was okay with where her place was in the world. She would never take her own life. Everybody in unison said it. I'm good with that. I personally do not think that there was foul play in the conventional sense. Now, let's go the other direction. Why would 3 dogs all go absolutely frigging nuts in the middle of the night looking at that mansion unless they saw something? I'm just saying. Dogs don't do that. No, they don't do that unless there's good reason to do it. I have no idea what they saw, but I say if dogs could talk, I think the solution to the case is right there. So, Margaret Clement, missing May 22nd, 1952, Australia. One of the biggest mysteries in Australia ever. And I got to say that the story intrigued me because this lady went from one end of the social scale all the way to the other end. And then she disappears at the end of her life. Very strange. It's funny. I come to the end of the video, Huck calms down, lays down, and I was ready to go to sleep. She was marching around here. Okay, thanks for being here. I greatly appreciate you. Remember, we are in the most important time right now on that Kickstarter campaign. We either get the 145,000 or we get nothing. Go to Kickstarter.com, type in Missing 411 National Parks. This is our next movie. We need some help from you to make it. We appreciate you very much. And remember, you can go to NA, like North America, NABigfootSearch.com. And we still have a few of these hardbacks for you. And I will sign them for you. That's the only hardback we have, and I will sign the hardback for you. So NABigfootSearch.com, go to the online store and you'll see it. And don't forget, Gather Up Events. Gather Up is one word. GatherUpEvents.com. The Bigfoot Caribbean Cruise. Thank you very much for your kindness. I'm sorry that Huck hasn't learned that rule yet. She was rude and loud during my event. I'm going to have to talk to her. But I love her, so I'll be nice. You guys take care. Paulides out.